Hey guys, tonight we are time traveling to a place where medicine hums in Latin and smells like dried lavender and something you really hope isn't rat. You ease through the creaky doors of a medieval ward, wide-eyed, barefoot, and very much in need of whatever counts as treatment here. You're not entirely sure what brought you in. A fever, a strange cough, or maybe a suspiciously philosophical spleen. The room flickers with candlelight, casting elongated shadows of iron tools across cold stone walls. Everything here echoes soft prayers from nuns in corners, the slosh of water from a wooden basin, and the slow groan of a nearby patient who probably came in for a headache and lost 3 pints of blood instead. You tiptoe past a man swaddled like a burrito, and you swear someone is whispering to a fish skeleton. Welcome to the medieval hospital experience, equal parts devotion, desperation, and faintly roasted turnip. A nun guides you to a cot that feels more wood than cushion. She offers you a warm cloth and something that might have been soup in a past life. You thank her, even though it tastes like wet garden hose. Hospitality, after all, is holy work. You glance around. On the far end, there's a man being read to from a Bible, while a mixture of mint leaves and some type of lard is slathered onto his chest. Beside him, a surgeon who might actually be a butcher on weekdays is boiling a knife. His patient doesn't look thrilled. That faintly metallic scent in the air, likely bloodletting. Yes, people here really believe that sickness is just too much blood with nowhere to go, so they cut you open, politely, and let the problem drip away. To be fair, they aren't totally wrong. Sometimes draining a fever or reducing swelling helped. But most of the time, it was a medieval gamble, like treating a sprained ankle with moonlight and faith. Historians still argue whether this was more ritual or more medicine. Frankly, your spleen doesn't care. It just wants a nap. At your bedside, an elderly monk shuffles over and places a damp cloth on your head. He murmurs a Latin blessing, then disappears behind a tapestry embroidered with saints and serpents. You wonder which of those is responsible for your sore throat. Near the fireplace, yes. The room has a crackling hearth, cozy, and potentially full of smoke-based bacteria. A pot steams with something herbal. A novice stirs it solemnly with a stick, longer than your forearm. You catch a whiff of rosemary, maybe sage, or just burnt bark. Another patient is being spoon-fed a concoction that smells like old beer and licorice root. She groans appreciatively, or maybe in protest, hard to tell. You make a mental note, never ask what's in the bowl. Suddenly, a bell rings. Not a gentle dinner chime, more like a someone is definitely in trouble clang. The nuns spring into action, robes flapping, hands steady. One carries a cross, another a jar of leeches. Yes, leeches. We'll get to those in a moment. For now, you just lie back and wonder whether your pillow is actually a bundled tunic. It is. Around you, illness feels like incense always hanging in the air, woven into every fabric and prayer. Yet somehow, there's comfort in it all. In the rhythm of chant, the soft scrape of ladles, the whispered hope that maybe, just maybe this time, the patient will walk out. You drift for a bit, not quite asleep, but lulled by the clatter of pewter bowls and distant liturgical hums. The woman next to you mutters something about frogs in her stomach. A passing healer nods solemnly and starts preparing a salve. You take this moment to do the thing every medieval patient does: quietly question your life choices. Why didn't you go to the town apothecary instead? Or just drink a full jug of wine and call it self-care? Ah, but there's no turning back now. You've been admitted. The linens may be itchy, the potions sketchy, and the staff occasionally exorcist adjacent, but you're officially under care, sort of. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still with me, drop your location and the current time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The nun returns. She tucks the blanket tighter and offers a small wooden cross. You accept, not because you're religious, but because it seems to work better than whatever's brewing in that pot. Somewhere in the background, a young novice sings a psalm as he prepares the next remedy. You don't know what it is, but if it's for the frog belly lady, you might want to hold your breath. You're still lying flat on your borrowed tunic pillow, gazing up at the beam-lined ceiling, when a man in crimson robes and a very patchy beard arrives with an alarming amount of confidence. He announces himself as a doctor. You squint. He looks like someone who sharpens knives for fun. But this, you're told, is your physician. He wears a robe that's definitely been soaked in wine at least once, and he carries a satchel full of tools, none of which look clean or medical. He adjusts his cap like he's about to recite a poem, and asks you to stick out your tongue. You obey. That seems harmless enough. He stares at it for a good 10 seconds, grunts, and says, "Ah yes, spleen overactivity. You have questions, none of which you ask, because in medieval Europe, asking too many questions gets you bled, or blessed, sometimes both. So, what is a doctor in this century? Not quite what you'd expect. There's no standard diploma, no nationwide exams, and certainly no years of experience LinkedIn section. A doctor might have attended a university, sure, but just as often, he's the town's barber, part-time astrologer, or that guy who read half a scroll once and has really strong opinions about garlic. The most educated among them study at places like Salerno or Montpellier, where they are taught how to interpret ancient Greek and Roman texts, mostly Galen, Hippocrates, and the occasional confusing Arabic translation. Historians still argue whether this reliance on old texts preserved knowledge or froze it in amber. Either way, it means that your diagnosis today will likely be based on something written 1,000 years ago, for someone who ate figs by the handful and never saw snow. This guy probably read De Medicina over a meal of boiled eel and figured he was ready. You learn that many of these so-called doctors get their start as apprentices, not necessarily to other physicians, but to monks, alchemists, or sometimes even executioners. After all, executioners know anatomy, sort of. And here's the kicker. The barbers were often the ones with the most hands-on experience. So if you wanted a tooth pulled, a boil lanced, or an arm sawed off, chances are your doctor was the same guy who cut your cousin's hair last Tuesday. Convenient, efficient, utterly terrifying. Your current doctor pulls out a metal rod and gently taps your knee. It makes a dull thunk, and he nods wisely. Melancholia, he mutters. Right, of course. He jots something in a small book, which you notice is actually upside down. You don't comment. One patient across the room has a broken leg and is being advised to soak it in vinegar, wrap it in cabbage, and chant the Pater Noster 3 times. Another has jaundice, and the treatment involves saffron, singing, and a heavy application of mustard seeds to the belly. You, on the other hand, have been prescribed rest, soft songs, and perhaps some therapeutic bleeding. You consider pretending to be asleep forever. The doctor continues his examination, moving to your pulse. He holds your wrist like it's a fragile loaf of bread and counts under his breath. You try to match your breathing to the rhythm of the chanting nun nearby, hoping it helps. Suddenly, he asks for your birth date and time. You give a half-hearted guess, and he nods, scribbles furiously, and says something about Saturn being in a watery sign. Astrology, it seems, is not just for relationships, it's for infections too. Saturn governs cold phlegms, he explains, as if that clears up everything. You nod. You've already accepted your fate. You learn, through this woozy haze of science and superstition, that many medieval doctors truly believed they were doing the best they could. And in a way, they were. They operated in a world with no understanding of bacteria, no antiseptics, and no anesthesia, yet they still fought to heal with whatever scraps of logic and hope they had. Did some of them overprescribe constantly? Were others just outright charlatans? Oh yes. But some were genuinely curious minds piecing together ancient texts, experimenting with treatments, and even keeping early patient records. You think back to the crimson-robed physician who diagnosed you by looking at your tongue. He's now across the room, humming as he grinds something in a mortar that smells alarmingly like wet hay and almonds. He smiles like a man who just reinvented medicine, or cheese. A young apprentice runs in holding a scroll. There's a new remedy from the East, he whispers excitedly, made with cinnamon and beetles. The doctor raises an eyebrow and gestures toward you. You groan internally. It's not all gloom, though. As odd as their methods were, these medieval doctors were trying to understand a body that had barely been mapped, and they did it without x-rays, germ theory, or TikTok medical influencers. They had only the stars, some plants, and a pile of questionable Latin. You finally relax a little. The candlelight flickers across the wall again, casting a dancing halo around the wooden crucifix hanging above. Somewhere, a patient starts softly singing. You might just survive this, or not. You're starting to feel marginally better, or maybe just resigned when the doctor returns. This time with a carved wooden diagram of a man, labeled in neat but indecipherable Latin. He points to a section just below the liver and says, "This is where your black bile lives." It's probably upset. Of course it is. You are about to get a crash course in one of the most deeply held beliefs of medieval medicine, the four humours. Everything, literally, everything about your health, personality, and mood is attributed to the swirling balance of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If that sounds like the inside of a regrettable soup, you're not wrong. According to the ancient wisdom of Galen and his pals, you are currently suffering from an excess of black bile. That's what the doctor says. Anyway, symptoms of too much black bile: lethargy, sadness, dry skin, and apparently your recent tendency to stare blankly into space while re-evaluating your life choices. Welcome to Melancholia, the classic medieval diagnosis for just about anything that doesn't involve pustules. The idea is this blood makes you lively. Phlegm keeps you chill. Yellow bile gives you a temper. and black bile makes you broody and poetic. Historians still argue whether this system was sincerely believed or simply a helpful framework for people who had no microscopes and way too many sheep. Today, it's an excuse to do some bloodletting and recommend a diet of warm lentils and light song to rebalance your inner fluids. The doctor suggests warm compresses and a series of gentle purges. Don't ask what that means yet. It's best if you're emotionally ready first. Across the room, a young man is being treated for an overabundance of blood. He's red-faced, full of energy, and talking far too quickly. The solution: a precise cut to the arm, a ceramic bowl, and a good 10 minutes of slow dripping. You watch with morbid fascination as the blood flows. The doctor hums, and the patient starts talking just a bit slower. But wait, it's not just fluids. The four humors also have temperaments attached. You, with your black bile problem, are probably a melancholic, thoughtful, introverted, a little dramatic, and someone who enjoys sad poetry on cloudy days. The guy with too much yellow bile, choleric, bossy, impatient, and prone to yelling at turnips. People didn't just treat illness by humor, they arranged entire personalities around it. Love life not going well. Try adjusting your bile ratio. Arguing too much with your neighbor. Maybe he's got excessive phlegm. Feeling uninspired at work. You need more blood, ideally, from your cousin. This bizarre personality fluid overlap was the basis of diagnosis and therapy for over 1,000 years. Even royalty got humored. Kings were bled and purged with frightening regularity, often before important speeches. If they passed out, well, at least their bile was balanced. The doctor returns with a mixture to soothe the spleen. You brace yourself as he hands over a wooden cup filled with warm, slightly gritty liquid. It tastes like cloves, vinegar, and sadness. You thank him politely, because you're already known as the melancholic patient, and frankly, that reputation feels about right. Just then, a chirpy nun appears at your side with a tray of foods chosen to rebalance your humors. You eye the lentils, parsnips, and gently wilted greens. You're not sure if you're supposed to eat them or write a reflective poem about them first. She explains, with the precision of a cook-priest hybrid, that cold and dry foods are best for your current imbalance. Absolutely no spicy meats or red wine, unless, of course, you want to spiral into choleric madness and start challenging the monks to chess. You nod. You've seen what happens when someone's humor mix goes off the rails. Last week, a patient with too much phlegm slept for 3 straight days and had to be poked with a goose feather to make sure he was still alive. You lie back again. The shadows on the wall now resemble a vaguely threatening ducks. That could be the black bile talking. As you drift, the thought hits you: this system, strange as it seems, gave people a way to feel like they had control over their health. Even if the methods were odd, even if the treatments were more guesswork than science, the idea that your internal weather could be observed, understood, and adjusted well, that's a kind of hope, even if it comes with leeches. One of the novices walks past you carrying a bundle of scrolls, muttering something about bile to blood ratios. You don't ask. You're still trying to process how much of your personality is apparently spleen-based. The nun returns to gently wipe your forehead with lavender water. The scent calms you until you realize it might be preparing your skin for leech application. You close your eyes. It's been a long day of introspection, bile management, and nearly drinking a potion made from boiled turnips and fear. Just another normal afternoon in the life of a melancholic patient. You awaken, or more accurately, blink slowly into semi-consciousness to the sound of something sloshing in a wooden bowl. It's too rhythmic to be soup. A soft humming follows, then a rustle. When you open your eyes, a young monk is standing over you with a glazed look of reverence and a clay jar teeming with small wiggling creatures. The leeches have arrived. Now, before you scream, and let's be honest, it's tempting, understand this leeches were considered one of the more refined options in the medieval medical toolkit. Yes, refined. When done correctly, this bloodletting method was believed to rebalance your humors, particularly your overabundant black bile, and in your case, the melancholia diagnosis meant your bloodstream was a swirling swamp of sadness that needed musical encouragement. Because here's the best part, some healers genuinely believed that leeches responded better to music. Your monk, ever so gently, begins humming a Latin hymn while tipping the jar toward your neck. The leeches, either enchanted or just confused, begin attaching with the dainty appetite of sommelier mosquitoes. One finds the delicate spot just under your jawline and nestles in like it's settling down for a warm evening with the vintage Cabernet. It's cold, slimy, and horrifyingly rhythmic. You feel the faint pulsing as it drinks, and the monk smiles like he's watching the sunrise. The idea was simple: leeches could extract just enough blood to ease inflammation, reduce fevers, and soothe overactive organs. Modern science admits begrudgingly that controlled bloodletting can sometimes help in rare cases. But in medieval times it was the cure-all, the great equalizer, the magical fix for everything from headaches to heartbreak. And when combined with music, even better. Some treatises advised chanting psalms during application. Others suggested singing softly to keep the leeches calm and cooperative. Historians still argue whether this practice was rooted in genuine belief or just a coping mechanism to make the whole ordeal seem less grotesque. The monk switches to a different melody, something in a minor key, and adds a little harp strumming in the background. Is this part of the healing or just aesthetic? You're too dizzy to care. One of the leeches falls off. Bloated like a happy raisin, the monk catches it in a cloth and nods solemnly, as if it just earned sainthood. You glance at your fellow patients. A man across the aisle has 2 leeches clinging to his temple and is murmuring what sounds suspiciously like nursery rhymes. Another patient in the corner clutches a rosary in one hand and a leech in the other. You're not sure which he's more devoted to. Some leeches were considered valuable special varieties from the Balkans, for example, were prized for their efficiency and temperament. There were even leech merchants who traveled with buckets and songbooks, promising only the finest bloodsuckers, trained on Gregorian chants and regional folk tunes. You're not sure where yours are from, but they seem to have a taste for melancholics. You try not to name them, but the one on your collarbone looks like a Gerald. To distract yourself, you hum softly along. The air smells of wax and clove, and you feel a strange lightness in your limbs. Maybe it's the blood loss. Maybe it's the music. Maybe you're beginning to understand how medieval people, faced with a baffling world, leaned into rituals that made suffering feel sacred. The nun arrives with a warm cloth and gently wipes away the trail left by Gerald. "You've done well," she whispers. "He sang with you. You don't know what that means, and frankly, you're afraid to ask. Of course, not everyone agreed on when or how to leech. Some texts suggested attaching them to the arms, others to the lower back, and one memorable scroll insisted the soles of the feet were ideal for drawing out melancholy through the ground. Scholars today still debate whether these were symbolic gestures or desperate guesses, but the logic, if you squint, holds a strange internal consistency. You lose track of time. The monk hums. The candles burn lower. Another leech disengages. Satisfied, you lie there, wondering what medieval spa packages might have looked like. Includes aromatics, hymnals, and 4 bloodthirsty neck friends. Robe not included. Eventually, the session ends. The monk gathers the leeches like precious coins, places them reverently in the clay jar, and retreats behind a tapestry. The blood left behind is gently blotted with linen soaked in vinegar and thyme. You are swaddled again, tucked in like a loaf of rising bread, and left to marinate in silence. As you lie there, you feel oddly grateful. Not for the leeches, exactly, but for the care, crude as it may be. Someone sang to you. Someone hummed while your blood was borrowed by ancient invertebrates. Someone believed this would heal you, and in a way, maybe it has. You're still drowsing in post-leech serenity when a new aroma floats through the ward earthy, peppery, with a hint of something aggressively herbal. Your eyes flutter open. A nun approaches with a bundle wrapped in linen and tied with a simple red cord. She unties it carefully to reveal a collection of small vials, twisted roots, bits of bone, and what you're pretty sure is a dead beetle. It's time for your herbal remedy, and maybe a bit of holy relics too, just to cover all the spiritual bases. She selects a few ingredients, crushes them into a paste using a stone mortar, then adds a few drops of oil. The result is smeared across a slice of bread and handed to you like a sacred sandwich. You sniff it. It smells like regret and basil. You eat it anyway, because this is the Middle Ages, and saying no to healing herbs is frowned upon, especially when they come from the elbow of a saint. Wait, what? Yes. Welcome to the magical world of relic-based medicine. If herbs didn't do the trick, many turned to the bones, ashes, or even blood-stained garments of saints for extra potency. One fragment of a martyr's femur, properly powdered and applied, was thought to banish fevers. Saintly elbow dust was a bestseller. Historians still argue whether this practice was a form of placebo, communal therapy, or simply the medieval version of spiritual crowdsourcing, and often it was combined with herbs because why settle for one cure when you can make a mystical smoothie? Your nun healer explains that thyme is for cleansing, sage for wisdom, and parsley to encourage cheerful digestion. She also whispers that the dead beetle helps keep away night spirits, though that one's a bit fringe, even in these parts. The paste makes your tongue tingle, or maybe that's the ghost of the beetle, hard to say. Nearby, a more senior patient is being rubbed down with a mixture of honey, goose fat, and crushed marigolds. The air is thick with the aroma of medieval ambition. One monk is waving incense over a patient's head, while softly reciting psalms. You think you catch a line about liver rot. The boundaries between medicine and religion blur constantly here. Healing isn't just physical, it's spiritual, emotional, even moral. Illness is often viewed as divine punishment or a test of faith. That sore throat. Maybe it's from mocking the bishop. that cough. Possibly unconfessed envy of your neighbor's prized goat. You lie there and try not to think envious thoughts about goats. A soft bell rings, signaling the arrival of a holy relic procession. 2 robed monks carry a golden box, believed to contain a fragment of Saint Apollonia's molar patron of toothaches. They stop by each patient, let the box hover briefly, and move on. It doesn't cure your aching joints, but it does bring a sense of peace, like being included in something vast and ancient. For those who couldn't access real relics, there were alternatives: fake bones, saint-shaped candles, or painted icons rubbed gently on sore limbs. Some healers swore by relic water, holy water soaked in a pouch that once held part of a saint's sandal. Was it scientific? Not remotely, but in a world full of plague, bad bread, and 0 antibiotics, hope had to take whatever form it could. You ask, weakly, if your remedy includes any relics. The nun grins and pats your shoulder. Only the sacred basil. You decide not to ask what makes it sacred. Meanwhile, your roommate is chewing on licorice root and muttering about a saint who once survived a swarm of stinging bees by humming. The logic: if humming worked for saints, it could work for joint pain too. He begins humming, softly at first, then louder, until a monk politely reminds him that not everyone is attempting musical healing right now. Your potion begins to settle in your stomach. You feel warm, not just from the herbs, but from the layers of meaning stacked into every treatment here. There's ritual in the rhythm, comfort in the repetition, whether it's powdered frankincense, whispered prayers, or wormwood steeped in wine. Every detail has purpose, even if the science doesn't hold. The ceremony does. You remember the singing leeches, the humming monk, the leech named Gerald, the relic parade, the beetle. Somewhere in this fragrant chaos, you begin to understand why people clung to these traditions. Healing wasn't just about stopping symptoms, it was about being seen, touched, sung to, and believed in. Even if you still smell faintly of sage and ancient molar, the candles burn lower now, the herbs start to lull you again. You feel something deep within you shift, whether it's the bile, the beetle, or just the overwhelming power of communal soup and sanctified vegetables. You'll never know, but you're starting to feel better. You wake again to the distant tolling of a bell, low, slow, and just slightly off-key. It's not the kind of bell that says dinner's ready. It's the kind that says someone probably saw a vision again, or time to pray and maybe rinse something in vinegar. Either way, you sit up, very slowly, so you don't dislodge anything still vaguely herbal stuck behind your ear. Your back cracks in 3 different registers. Today's setting is a little different. You're wheeled well, dragged gently into what the nun refers to as the healing chapel, which is, let's be honest, a small monastic chamber with high stone walls, an unsettlingly detailed fresco of Judgment Day, and one stained glass window that looks like someone sneezed halfway through painting it. This is where faith meets medicine head-on. Hospitals, you discover, are rarely run by doctors in the modern sense. No white coats, no clipboards. Instead, you're greeted by nuns and monks in heavy robes, carrying bowls of steaming barley, bundles of dried rosemary, and sometimes a crucifix in one hand and a poultice of mashed onions in the other. It's all part of the same treatment plan. You settle onto a stone bench with a cushion that's mostly straw and optimism. A monk begins to chant not to you directly, but to the space itself, cleansing the air, he explains, also pleasing to the saints, and possibly distracting from the odor of fermented leeks being applied to the guy next to you. The room smells like incense, old books, beeswax, and onion foot wraps. Medieval hospitals, especially in Europe, are often extensions of monasteries. They're not just healing centers, they're acts of religious devotion. Tending to the sick is a holy duty, a path to salvation. The patients may be groaning and oozing from various places, but to the monks, it's sacred work. Every wound bandaged is a prayer answered, every fever broken, a tiny miracle. You look up at the fresco again. It shows angels pulling the souls of the healed up to heaven, while the unhealed, well, let's say they're heading for a warmer climate. You shuffle slightly to the left, just to be under the angel side. Down the corridor, you hear someone playing a psaltery, a sort of medieval harp that sounds like sadness and tea at the same time. It floats through the corridors like a gentle fog, mingling with the soft creak of wooden wheels and whispered Latin. One of the monks begins to apply a warm compress to your joints, onion and mustard seed mixed with a bit of holy oil. It smells aggressive, but the warmth is oddly comforting. You try not to think about the fact that it's the same oil they use to anoint dying people. The guy next to you, let's call him Walter, is explaining how the onions are supposed to draw out the bad air and invite in the angel humors. He winks. He's clearly been here a while, possibly too long. Walter also has a theory that the placement of your bed affects your recovery. If your feet point east, he says, the healing flows better. You quietly reposition yourself, just in case. Outside the chapel, the hospital garden rustles softly in the wind. A few patients are being wheeled or dragged out for some fresh air. Medicinal herbs grow along the walkway: lavender, rue, wormwood, and mint. A nun waters them with practiced grace while reciting the day's scripture. Somewhere, a chicken clucks. You hope it's not part of an upcoming remedy. You're handed a wooden cup filled with warm, spiced water infused with cloves and rosemary. It's surprisingly good, possibly the best thing you've had since arriving. You ask what it is. Boiled hope, the nun says, smiling. You sip it slowly. She's only half joking. Scholars today still debate whether monastic hospitals truly improved health outcomes. Some say the clean linens, structured care, and relative quiet offered genuine benefits. Others argue that without an understanding of germs, most patients simply lingered in marginally nicer places before succumbing to whatever lurked in their spleens. But one thing is certain: people were treated as souls, not just symptoms, and that counts for something. You're wrapped again in layers of wool and wisdom, laid back on a new bench that somehow feels even harder than the last. Above you, candlelight flickers against the ancient stones, casting shadows that look vaguely like saints or possibly onions, depending on the angle. You hear soft humming from the far end of the room. It's not medical, not formal, just one of the nuns singing quietly to herself as she ties a bundle of herbs with twine. You imagine how many patients she's tended to, how many strange ointments she's prepared, and how many prayers she's whispered when medicine ran out of answers. You close your eyes, breathe in the scent of rosemary and beeswax, and feel the warmth of the compress soak through your bones. Maybe the monks and nuns didn't always know what they were doing in a medical sense, but they cared. deeply, and sometimes that's enough to help you rest. You're barely back on your cot before a scholar enters the ward, robes flapping, arms cradling a stack of parchments like he's rescuing sacred kittens. He sets them on a wooden table, smooths out the top scroll, and clears his throat with all the confidence of someone who's about to perform medicine. This, dear patient, is your introduction to the world of rhyming medical texts. Yes, medicine by poetry. Your doctor, or maybe an over-enthusiastic monk with good penmanship, begins to read from what is unmistakably a long verse about stomach cramps. It rhymes, it has meter, it is not helpful. If your bowels do churn with fiery grief, take balm and mint to find relief. You blink, he nods, pleased. These metrical medical texts called regimen poems were widespread, particularly in the high to late Middle Ages. Physicians and apprentices alike believed that rhymes made information easier to remember. And let's be honest, if you're memorizing hundreds of recipes involving vinegar, cow dung, and poppy seeds, you'll take any help you can get. The one currently being recited at your bedside seems to be equal parts diagnosis and bedtime lullaby. It suggests saffron for sadness, fennel for flatulence, and a hot stone pressed near thy loins for literally everything else. The last verse includes the phrase, beware the toad in winter's breath. You hope that's metaphorical. You ask if he's sure the poem applies to your condition. He adjusts his hood and mutters, it's the closest match we have for your pulse and dreams. Fantastic. The scroll itself is beautifully illustrated. Tiny painted vines curl along the margins, with tiny faces peeking out of the leaves. You're not sure if that's decorative or diagnostic. Either way, it's more whimsical than helpful. Your caretaker now tries to tailor a treatment for you based on the poem. He mixes a small amount of honey with powdered cumin and something that might be crushed pearl. You watch him stir it carefully, like a baker preparing a nervous soufflé. He hands it over with a flourish and a second couplet. Drink this slow, for spleen and bone. It calms the thoughts and soothes the groan. You sip, it tastes philosophical, a bit like an argument between a spice rack and an oyster. Medieval doctors loved writing in rhyme. Latin, Arabic, vernacular French, it didn't matter. If you could treat constipation in couplets, you were a scholar. One of the most famous examples is the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a 12th century guide to health that offers gems like, if you take wine, let it be red. White will go straight to your head. Even basic anatomy lessons came in rhyme. The liver boils and the stomach churns, while spleen doth hoard what the stomach spurns. You repeat it under your breath. Congratulations, you're studying medieval gastroenterology. Historians still argue whether the rhyme schemes were meant for patients or doctors. Some say they were teaching tools. Others think they were like prescription jingles, memorable and mildly manipulative. Either way, they gave medical knowledge a kind of musical permanence. Even if the facts were fuzzy, the verses stuck. Back in your ward, the chanting has given way to soft murmurs. Another apprentice arrives, holding a newer scroll and a deep frown. The verse for your condition, he whispers, might have been miscopied. There's an argument whether it says basil for fever or badger for fever. You eye him carefully. Please, you say, no badgers. He nods and scribbles something, then retreats to cross-reference with another poem. You hear him muttering, "Fever, fever, blessed be, take from earth or from the sea." You recline again, letting the soft rhythm of nonsense and well-meaning quatrains wash over you. Across the room, a patient is being read to from a romance epic about a knight whose dysentery led him to a vision of Saint Sebastian. It's unclear whether the moral is medicinal or motivational. A breeze slips through the shuttered window. The candles flutter. The page of your doctor's scroll ripples and folds slightly over a line about wormwood and rose petals. He smooths it down and clears his throat for verse 6. You don't understand most of it, but you understand the effort. Someone cared enough to rhyme a cure for you. Someone turned confusion into cadence. And even if it doesn't make you better, it might just make you feel remembered. You're just drifting off into a pleasant fugue of herbal rhymes and faint harp strings when a rather stern-looking figure glides into the ward, holding a shallow brass bowl filled with, is that urine? Yes, yes, it is the figure. A physician of the scholarly sort, half robe, half eyebrows, places the bowl on a stand near the window and peers into it like it's a fine glass of wine. He gently swirls it. He holds it up to the light. Then he gives it a long, satisfied sniff. You hope? For his sake. He has a very forgiving nose. Welcome to the science and the art of uroscopy. In medieval medicine, your pee was practically a resume. Doctors believed it revealed everything about your internal state, from your mood to your blood balance, to which planet was out to get your spleen that week. Color, clarity, sediment, aroma, it all mattered. Pale yellow with bubbles might mean phlegm. Dark orange with a greenish tinge, definitely too much bile, or maybe the wrath of Saturn. He offers you a knowing look and says, your urine has a melancholy hue. You're not sure whether to feel complimented or concerned. The brass bowl is placed beside a small parchment bearing illustrations of other urine types, a sort of medieval Pantone chart for bodily fluids. On one end is a cheerful yellow labelled choleric vigour. On the other, something murky and grey, labelled doom, possibly spiritual. And of course, there's a moon drawn in the corner. Because here's the twist, your health doesn't depend just on your fluids. It also depends on the stars. Your doctor consults a small astrological wheel hanging from his belt. He asks your birth hour again, this time more sternly, and scribbles a few notes in the margins of your urine parchment. Apparently, you're in a saturnine phase, which is why you've been sighing so much and enjoying the taste of rain. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians genuinely believed in astrological diagnosis or simply used it to impress nervous patients. But for centuries, urine and planets went hand in hand. Diagnosis was a cosmic affair. You're handed a small loaf of bread and told it's been baked during a favorable alignment of Jupiter and Mercury. It will strengthen your lungs, the nun explains. You nod and chew dutifully, tasting optimism and oregano. Across the room, another patient has his own urine assessed, followed by a brief scolding. Too hot, the doctor says, and too foamy. Has he been eating onions again? The patient shrugs guiltily and mutters something about a stew. You glance nervously at your own breakfast tray. You wonder how far this logic goes. If Jupiter rules the liver and Mars the blood, does Venus help with gas? Someone probably wrote a treatise about it. In fact, someone did. Medieval physicians wrote entire manuals matching celestial alignments to symptoms. One chart even advised against surgery during a waxing moon unless the patient was right-handed and born in April. Is it medically sound? Not remotely, but is it strangely comforting? Absolutely. You lie back again as your doctor completes his cosmic calculations. He traces a small glyph onto your forehead with his finger, just a smudge of warm wine and ash. This will keep your spirits level, he whispers, especially while Mars is turbulent. You decide not to tell him Mars is always turbulent. You glance at the window, where a sliver of moonlight falls across the room. Another patient begins to hum a lullaby in French. The smell of rosemary rises again, mingling with beeswax, and the faintest trace of boiled leek. It's all absurd, you think, and yet strangely beautiful. This world believes you are a microcosm of the universe, that your organs spin in harmony with the stars, that your mood is shaped by planetary tension, that your pee is a message from the cosmos. You, dear patient, are a celestial ecosystem, slightly damp, vaguely confused but cosmically significant. And right now, you're finally starting to feel like the stars are aligning in your favor. You're resting again, knees covered with a scratchy wool blanket that's just slightly too short, when a boy probably 14, possibly possessed, stumbles into the ward with his hands over his jaw and tears in his eyes. He's moaning in that very specific way that only someone with a serious toothache can muster. The nun leading him gently places a cloth-wrapped stone between his palms and guides him to a bench. A few feet away, a doctor emerges from the shadows with a set of tongs that should never be that rusty. You start to feel nervous, even though your own teeth are currently behaving. Toothaches, in medieval times, were no small matter. They were agony, public humiliation, and sometimes a divine test, all rolled into one. And the cure, well, if you were lucky, herbs and prayers. If you weren't trepanning, yes, removing part of your skull to fix a dental issue, because in the great guessing game of medieval medicine, it wasn't always about treating the symptom. Sometimes the pain in your jaw clearly meant your head needed a hole in it. You stare in horror as the doctor pulls out a small drill. He mutters something about releasing pressure from the demon canal and thankfully moves on to a different patient before doing anything irreversible, but the fact that it was even on the table, that's enough to make you clench your molars. Still, trepanning, drilling, or scraping a hole into the skull was a relatively widespread practice. Some did it for head trauma, some for seizures, and yes, sometimes for inexplicable face pain. Historians still argue whether it was rooted in medical theory or just an old tradition that no one had the nerve to retire. To their credit, some patients even survived it. But let's rewind to the simpler stuff. Most medieval people believed toothaches came from toothworms, tiny, squirmy creatures burrowing inside your molars, partying wildly, and generally causing mayhem. This theory, bizarre as it sounds, persisted for centuries. There are even texts describing what these worms looked like, usually with the same vibe as a sea monster sighting. You reach up to touch your own jaw. No pain, no worms, so far. Back at the bench, the moaning boy is offered a rinse made from wine, vinegar, and crushed mint. It's meant to stun the tooth demons. He gurgles dramatically. The doctor nods approvingly. You decide to take very good care of your teeth moving forward. Some people treated toothaches with heated stones placed under the jaw. Others burnt herbs like henbane or belladonna and directed the smoke toward the open mouth. A few even had their heads tied tightly in cloth, the pressure supposedly scaring the worms away. There's a story of one woman having a live eel coiled around her neck to frighten her molar into good behavior. You hope that was more of a village myth than an official procedure. You watch as the doctor sharpens a small metal pick on a stone. The sound is unpleasant. Another nun arrives, carrying a box of soothing powders, which are mostly powdered cloves and mild opiates, yes. Those were used too. Legal, accessible, and sometimes brewed into sleepy teas. In desperate cases, people turned to blacksmiths or traveling tooth pullers. These weren't gentle practitioners. They were large men with large hands who believed in speed and spectacle. Sometimes they performed in public squares, pulling teeth to the sound of lutes and applause. The faster the yank, the bigger the crowd. The boy next to you finally falls asleep after a compress of mashed onions and poppy tea. His jaw is still swollen, but he's stopped crying. Small victories. You glance at the tools again. Among them is a trepanning drill shaped like a corkscrew. You try not to imagine its use, but somewhere deep in your medieval surroundings, you realize that to them, this was progress. This was science. They didn't know about nerves or bacteria, but they knew pain, and they had centuries of trial and error rituals to treat it, many awful, some weirdly effective, all deeply human. As a reward for surviving yet another round of terrifying treatments, even just as a witness, you're given a bit of hard cheese and crusty bread. You chew slowly, carefully, whispering a silent plea to every saint of dentistry. The bread is stale, the cheese is oddly sweet. But your teeth hold. You lie back down, more grateful than ever that your skull remains unventilated and your molars unmolested. The candlelight flickers against the wall, casting long shadows of saints, leeches, and drill bits. You sigh. If nothing else, your jaw works just fine for that. You're reclining again, jaws intact, spleen moderately soothed when a new kind of hush falls over the ward. Not the sleepy kind, the scholarly kind. The kind that means someone important is about to talk at you, possibly in Latin. A procession of students files in, each one clutching a thin wax tablet and looking appropriately pale and pious. Behind them marches a professor in a velvet cap, large enough to double as a picnic cloth. He approaches the center of the room, lifts his hands in a dramatic flourish, and declares, "Today, we examine the mysteries of the body. You're about to witness a university medical lecture, and it comes with a corpse, that's right." On a nearby table lies a human body, shrouded in linen and mystery, donated willingly or otherwise to the cause of medieval anatomical education. These public dissections were rare, sacred, and often held in cold winter rooms to reduce, well, the smell. The students crowd around a table as the professor opens a dusty copy of Galen, the ancient Roman physician whose writings remain the gold standard, even though he never dissected a single human in his life. He wrote everything based on animals. But in medieval medicine, quoting Galen is basically like quoting divine scripture. Challenging him is not advised unless you're ready for some ecclesiastical side-eye. So here's how it works. The professor reads Galen's text aloud, usually in Latin, while a second man, called the sector, does the actual cutting. The professor doesn't lower himself to touch the body. He points. He proclaims, he occasionally mispronounces. But the scalpel stays with the assistant, who's usually sweating buckets and silently praying the intestines don't explode. You watch as the sheet is pulled back. A hand, pale and rigid, falls to one side. The students flinch. A few scribble furiously. Others just stare, wide-eyed, torn between reverence and nausea. The sector makes the first incision. There's no anesthesia, of course, though the corpse doesn't mind. You, on the other hand, shift slightly in your cot and try not to imagine what it might be like to be mistaken for today's anatomy lesson. The professor continues his monologue. Behold the liver, where the passions dwell, and here, the spleen seat of melancholy. He points with a silver rod that gleams ominously in the torchlight. One student sneezes and nearly drops his tablet. It's a strange, contradictory moment. This is science, real anatomy, a human body opened for study. And yet, the script being followed is ancient, rigid, based more on Greek philosophy than actual observation. If the body doesn't match the book, the body must be wrong. Historians still argue whether these lectures pushed medicine forward or held it hostage. But one thing's certain for many students. It was their only chance to see what lay beneath the skin. One dissection per year, if they were lucky, often performed on criminals' bodies, donated post-execution. You suspect today's cadaver was one of those unlucky few. You lean in as much as your cot allows. The sector lifts the liver, his hands trembling slightly. Note the color. The professor says, a healthy organ. The humors are harmonious. It's very obviously green. The students nod anyway. You can't help but feel a strange reverence. This isn't just a medical display. It's a performance. A ceremony. The quiet murmuring of Latin, the clink of tools on bone, the flicker of firelight on slick flesh, it all feels otherworldly, like the body is being read like a sacred text. And in many ways, it is. In a world without microscopes, hospitals, or reliable thermometers, the human body is the ultimate mystery, a puzzle box of bile, bones, and borrowed breath. To see inside it, even once, is like peeking into the gears of the universe. As the lecture winds down, the professor closes his book with a dramatic sigh. Thus, he says, we confirm the truths of Galen. No one mentions the unexpected number of kidneys. Probably best not to. The students bow and file out. The corpse is covered again. The tools are wiped down with wine and linen. The air smells of iron and damp parchment. You lie back and process what you've seen. Somewhere in that cold chamber, between the ancient text and the fresh incision, a tiny spark of modern medicine flickered. Just a flicker, but enough. And you're just grateful they didn't ask for volunteers. You're back in your cot, half wrapped in scratchy linen and 3 layers of increasingly crumbly blankets. When the smell hits you, not the sweet tang of herbs, not even the medicinal funk of leeches and lavender. No, this is something more aggressive, like a mixture of boiled turnip, yeast, and fear. Welcome to the bathhouse, where hygiene is a public event, modesty is negotiable, and bacteria throw medieval raves. 2 nuns gently hoist you onto a wooden platform that creaks ominously under your weight. A basin of steaming water is placed nearby, its surface floating with rose petals and something suspiciously twig-like. It's bath day, or as you come to understand. Your first step toward either cleanliness or a close encounter with the bubonic plague. The water is tepid by the time it touches your skin. A novice pours it slowly from a jug, murmuring something about purification. It's oddly soothing until the sponge comes out. It's not a soft loofah. It's more like a mildly judgmental sea creature. You're scrubbed, rinsed, and wrapped again. The other patients line up along benches nearby, some fully immersed in barrels, others sitting bare-kneed in shallow tubs. Modesty isn't the priority. Survival is, and in the medieval world, bathing is both a treatment and a threat. Bathhouses were common throughout Europe and the Islamic world. In some places, they were elaborate public centers. Imagine spa day meets sacred ritual, with less privacy and more vinegar. People believed that heat opened the pores and allowed bad humors to exit the body, particularly melancholy and phlegm. The logic: sweat it out, then rinse, then oil yourself like a festive chicken. And it kind of worked, until the Black Death arrived. Suddenly, pores became suspicious. The theory spread that bathing opened the body to dangerous airs, letting in the plague through all those nicely cleaned pores. So while some still bathed with fervor, others began to avoid water like it owed them money. A few even believed that dirt repelled disease, which led to the least romantic period of perfumery history. You glance across the room. One man is being doused in rose water while his feet soak in mustard seed. Another is having his hair trimmed over a basin of wine. A nun is scrubbing someone's back with a cloth dipped in warmed ale. You can't help but wonder if this is supposed to heal, or just prep you for being served with gravy. A monk strolls by with a small book listing bathing protocols: who may bathe, how often, and what herbs are recommended based on the moon phase. You're informed that today is excellent for rosemary, but dangerous for fennel. You nod solemnly. No fennel. Got it. Historians still debate whether medieval bathing habits were more hygienic than previously thought. Some cities had complex systems for public baths and fresh water. Others bathed once a year and hoped for the best. But even in the best-case scenario, warm communal water and shared sponges made bathhouses a petri dish of piety and plague. You're handed a towel, read a somewhat absorbent sheet, and a small vial of herbal oil. It smells like sage and pine resin. For the joints, they say. You dab some on your elbows and instantly feel 12% more sanctified. But then you hear it. A cough. A wet, rasping cough from the far corner of the bathhouse. Everyone freezes. Eyes turn. A man sits hunched over in his tub, face pale, eyes unfocused. A faint ring of dark bruises along his neck. Someone whispers a word that makes the air chill despite the steam plague. He's gently escorted out. The water is drained. The tub is scrubbed. Every herb in the vicinity is suddenly employed in a desperate act of purification. Smoke from a smouldering rosemary bundle fills the room, and the novice who brought the poor man in begins quietly crying into a towel. You are already dressed again, rapidly, and you're strongly considering crawling under a blanket and declaring yourself immune by sheer willpower. There's no true understanding of infection here, not yet. Germ theory is centuries away, but people know. They know when something is wrong. They know to feel the buboes, the coughing, the way some people simply don't wake up, and they do what they can with what they have: vinegar, fire, hope. As you leave the bathhouse, A monk pats your shoulder and offers a clove to chew on. Keeps the plague from the throat, he says. Or so we hope. You nod, chew, and walk back toward your cot, feeling somehow cleaner and dirtier at the same time. You return to the ward wrapped in a towel that's doing its best, but frankly not enough. Your skin feels scrubbed raw. Your joints smell faintly of pine resin and desperation, and your throat tastes like clove. Still small victories. You're not coughing, not weeping, and no one's leading you to the quarantine corner. That's a win. As you settle back into bed, a soft voice calls out from the doorway. You there, fever boy. I've got something for your insides. You look up to see an elderly woman in a cloak patched with wool, linen, and what might once have been a table runner. She's carrying a small basket full of roots, bottles, and something wrapped in pig bladder. She is not a nun. She is not a monk. She is not affiliated with any university or cathedral. She is a peasant healer, and somehow, people say her cures actually work. The nun accompanying her raises a cautious eyebrow, but steps aside. She's been allowed in, she murmurs. Only because the last 6 she treated are still alive. You sit up straighter. She approaches you, eyes sharp and movements brisk. You've been sweating, she says, not as a question, but as a diagnosis. Liver's hot, blood slow, feet are too quiet. You blink. She pulls a small turnip from her bag, holds it up to your forehead, nods, and puts it back. This is happening. She begins preparing a remedy on a small stool beside you. Out comes garlic, fresh and pungent, along with a handful of crushed barley, dried mint, and the tiniest pinch of ash. Fire balance, she mutters. Then she pours in a splash of something that smells like extremely confident ale. The whole mixture is wrapped in a cloth and tied to your wrist. Let the heat go through the hand, she says. Matter of fact, you've officially been turnipped and garlicked. You're not alone. Peasant cures are everywhere, tucked between the cracks of church doctrine and academic authority. While the monks chant and the physicians read, these women, often older, often barefoot, often called wise, are out in the fields gathering dandelion roots, picking nettles, and whispering to bees. They don't quote Galen, they quote seasons, smells, and things their grandmothers learned from the time someone got bit by a goat and survived with just a poultice of moss. Historians still argue whether these folk healers were more effective than their credentialed counterparts, but records show that even monks would secretly ask them for advice, especially when university medicine involved heated gold coins and patient screaming. The old woman hums a little song as she prepares your next treatment. A small cloth bag of dried lavender, mustard seed, and something she doesn't name is placed under your pillow. For sleep, she says, and to keep the bad dreams where they belong. Your head relaxes into the scent. It's earthy, floral, strange but calming. She pats your foot, turns to leave, and calls over her shoulder, no salted meat for 3 days, or singing. It stirs the spleen. You nod solemnly. After she's gone, the nun returns and picks up the turnip she left behind. She looks at it, shrugs, and gently blesses it. Can't hurt, she mutters. You lie back, feeling oddly peaceful. The rhythms of peasant medicine are not written in books or sung in cathedrals. They live in gardens, kitchens, and whispered prayers over bubbling pots. These healers may not understand the body in Latin, but they understand it in touch, smell, and quiet, stubborn knowing. And honestly, that garlic barley poultice is doing something. Or maybe you just like having your hands smell like soup. Hard to say. Your neighbor, a grizzled man with a cough that could rattle doors, asks what she gave you. You tell him garlic, turnip, barley, and a stern warning about spleen music. He nods. Classic combo, he says, clearly jealous. You fall asleep faster than usual. Maybe it's the herbs, maybe it's the exhaustion, maybe it's the quiet, undeniable feeling that someone looked at you and said, I've seen this before, and I can help. And in a world of saints' elbows and moon-phase surgeries, that kind of certainty is its own kind of miracle. The sun rises with a golden streak through the warped glass window, casting a beam of light directly onto your bed and regrettably your face. You squint. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crows with enough dramatic flair to suggest he thinks he discovered dawn. You sit up slowly, stretching joints that sound like someone stepping on old floorboards. A nun passes by and hands you a bowl. It's warm, mushy, and then, moving, you blink. She smiles. Your ointment for the day, she says. It's a bit chunky and somehow feathery. You've reached the animal-based remedies portion of medieval healing. Because when people didn't know why the body did what it did, they looked to animals who, apparently, were always on hand, always mildly magical, and rarely happy about being turned into medicine. You sniff the bowl. It smells like goose and sulfur, possibly duck regret. Today's treatment, as it turns out, involves a paste of goose grease mixed with crushed herbs and rubbed into your chest. It opens the lungs, the nun says, and pleases the inner frog. You hope that's metaphorical. You say nothing. The grease is warm, at least, as it soaks into your skin. She explains other cures you might be lucky or unlucky enough to receive. Owl fat for earaches, pig's bladder for swelling, a cat laid across your stomach to absorb the heat. Yes, a living cat. Once, she says, a man with joint pain was told to sleep next to a sheep for 3 days straight. The wool draws out the ache, she explains. And the sheep likes the company. Even you have to admit that sounds cozy. Another patient in the ward is having a mixture of ox saliva and barley applied to his foot. Why? Because his foot smells too moist. You do not ask further questions. A monk walks in with a basket of oddities: dried mice, powdered antlers, and a very confident hedgehog. He's here to prepare medicine for the abbot, who apparently has a bout of melancholy and crabbed digestion. One remedy calls for roasted beaver tail, another the ashes of a black hen, taken at dawn, mixed with milk and recited over by someone with a gentle voice. You're starting to think the gentle voice is the most curative part. A woman down the corridor is being treated for a rash with snail jelly and warm honey. It soothes the skin. Her caretaker says, also deters witches. 2 for 1. It's hard not to marvel at how deeply animals are woven into the medical thinking of this world. They're not just food or companions, they're pharmacological partners. A feather here, a whisper of hoof oil there, and suddenly you have a salve, a poultice, or at least an excuse to say, we tried everything. Historians still argue how much of this worked versus how much was tradition carried on by sheer hope and anecdotal evidence. But there is some truth buried in it all. Goose fat does retain heat. Honey is antimicrobial. Cat cuddles are, let's face it, Emotionally healing, even if the science wasn't understood. People were observing, experimenting, and adapting creatively. You finish your goose grease rub down and sit up, slightly slick and significantly confused. A small cloth sachet is handed to you, filled with hair from a horse's tail and dried mint. You're supposed to wear it around your neck. It encourages strength, the nun says, and keeps snakes away. You glance around. There are no snakes. It's working. A young boy walks in, limping slightly. He's told to place a frog on his knee and recites the Pater Noster backwards. He looks skeptical but does it anyway. The frog seems mostly unbothered. Another patient has his head wrapped in rabbit fur to cure headaches. Someone nearby asks if it's working. I forgot I had a headache, he says, because now my head itches. That counts. Right, you lie back again. The sachet of mint and horse brushing your collarbone, and think about how strange and wonderful this whole ecosystem of healing really is. When you have no microscopes, no thermometers, and very few reliable tools, you turn to what you do have: animals, herbs, stories, and instinct. And honestly, you'd rather wear a goose fat compress than get trepanned. Probably. You're dozing in a warm haze of goose grease and herbal steam when the ward doors open with a solemn creak. A man is brought in, eyes wide, hands trembling, muttering things you can't quite make out. One moment he's pleading with someone invisible. The next, he's staring blankly at the ceiling like it owes him an apology. The attendants whisper behind cupped hands. He's been touched. The mind, not the blood. And just like that, you find yourself in the presence of a medieval mental health case, or what people back then called possession, madness, or, if they were feeling poetic, being stormed by spirits. Within minutes, a small group assembles 2 monks, a nun, and a man in an extremely large crucifix. The patient is gently restrained, ropes tied not cruelly, but firmly. A bowl of holy water is placed nearby. A bell rings once, softly, as if summoning attention from forces unseen. Here comes the exorcism. Now, before you panic, know that this was often the first line of defense for anyone exhibiting symptoms we'd today associate with anxiety, depression, epilepsy, schizophrenia, you name it. Medieval society didn't have psychology. It had theology, astrology, and the deeply held belief that spirits sometimes took up residence in the soft corners of your soul. The lead monk begins a litany in Latin, rhythmic and deliberate. He sprinkles the holy water, gently flicking droplets toward the patient, who flinches and begins to chant something under his breath. You watch with wide eyes from your cot, unsure whether you're witnessing healing or theater or both. A censer is brought in, swinging thick clouds of frankincense across the room. The patient coughs, then laughs, then weeps. You glance at a nearby nun, who notices your alarm and whispers. Sometimes they just need comfort and prayers. Sometimes the devil. But sometimes, she adds, lowering her voice, they just need rest and someone to listen. It's surprisingly modern, that last part. Not all cases called for exorcism. Sometimes, patients were treated with gentle methods, calming herbs, soft music, massage, or simply being kept in a quiet place where no one expected them to explain themselves. Valerian root for sleep, chamomile for nerves. And always, prayer, because if you didn't know the brain had chemicals, At least you could appeal to heaven. And there were always those who blurred the line. Women who saw visions, men who heard voices, children who dreamed too vividly, all teetering on the edge between sanctity and sickness. Saints and lunatics often shared similar symptoms. The only real difference was whether anyone important decided to believe them. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more compassionate or more fearful when it came to mental illness. Some communities embraced the afflicted, seeing them as touched by God. Others hid them away. And, of course, there were darker times when fear led to accusations, to trials, to flames. But here, in this room, on this day, the monk finishes his chant, the patient is eased back onto a bed, and the ropes are removed. Someone brings broth, someone else brushes his hair. No fire, no shouting. Just a ward full of people doing what they can with what they understand. You lie back, still watching. It strikes you that medieval medicine, chaotic and bizarre as it seems, had room for the soul. It acknowledged suffering that wasn't visible, pain that didn't bleed, grief that sat heavy in the chest and refused to budge. You're handed a small pouch to place under your pillow. To calm your thoughts, the nun says, inside is lavender, rose petals, and a bit of feather. You press it to your cheek. It smells like bedtime and gentle promises. Somewhere down the hall, the recently exorcised man begins humming. Not the chant from earlier, something softer, something human. And for the first time since you arrived, the ward is quiet. Not from fear, not from sleep, from peace. You're just dozing off again, cheek pressed into your lavender-scented pillow pouch, when a distant flutter of silk and the clink of polished boots rouses the entire ward into a low, reverent murmur. Heads turn. Nuns straighten their habits. Someone tries to hide a goat under a blanket. The royal physician has arrived. And not just any royal physician. He's wearing robes stitched with gold thread and a belt that might be made of actual unicorn leather. His hair is oiled. His hands not a callus in sight. This man has never touched a leech in his life, because now you're entering the strange, scented, and extravagantly nonsensical world of royal medicine, where cures are as rare and ridiculous as the crowns they're meant to serve. He walks with the air of someone who charges by the minute, in his satchel powdered gems, dried rose petals, an ivory spoon, and something that looks disturbingly like ground crystallized jellyfish. You are not important enough to speak to him, but you are allowed to observe as he sweeps past you and heads toward the special chamber at the far end of the corridor. There, behind embroidered curtains and marble-tiled walls, lies a nobleman, not quite dying, not quite thriving, just sort of wilting luxuriously. A case of exhaustion of the humours, no doubt, possibly brought on by overeating duck. The royal physician removes a small silver vial from his bag and lets a few flakes of something glittery fall into a goblet of warmed goat's milk. The patient sips and sighs theatrically. That, you learn, is gold leaf, believed to restore balance to noble blood and make the internal organs feel more dignified. You overhear whispers from the nun's unicorn horn was recommended first, but the last one turned out to be a narwhal tusk. Classic mix-up. Royal treatments weren't just more expensive, they were wildly more imaginative. Where peasants got onions and beetles, nobles got sapphire dust, swan fat, and pearls dissolved in vinegar. A persistent cough, inhale steam infused with cinnamon, saffron, and crushed rubies. Digestive upset, drink a tea brewed with rose petals, frankincense, and wine that had been stored beneath a monastery for exactly 11 years. Historians still argue whether these treatments were purely symbolic rituals to reinforce class divides, or if physicians actually believed in the efficacy of powdered emerald. Either way, you wouldn't want to foot the bill. One vial of dragon's blood, actually red resin from a palm tree, cost more than most people made in a year. But even royalty couldn't escape the more enthusiastic aspects of medieval medicine. Leeching was still performed, though only with virgin leeches, which is a phrase you wish you hadn't learned, and bloodletting done with gold-plated lancets. Of course, nothing says healthcare like bleeding into a jeweled bowl. You peer down at your own stained wool blanket, garlic still lingering behind your ears, and feel a twinge of jealousy. Then the nobleman begins retching gently into a silk-lined bucket, and you feel better about your lot. The physician exits the chamber with a practiced expression of mystery. He dabs his forehead with a rose-scented cloth and offers a few nods to the surrounding staff. One apprentice scurries behind him, carrying what appears to be a stuffed peacock. Before he leaves, he turns to the attending monks and says, "Keep the patient calm. Perhaps some lute music. No more plums. You lie back, amused. Maybe these cures were absurd, but the intent behind them was real. Nobles wanted healing just as badly as peasants did, maybe more so, since they'd never been taught to endure discomfort without a small orchestra nearby. There's a lesson in that. Soon, the royal entourage departs, leaving only the echo of soft boots and forgotten perfume. You're handed a bowl of plain broth, simple, hearty, and not glittering in the slightest. It's oddly comforting. Because as it turns out, boiled garlic beats sapphire dust every time, especially when your spleen's been temperamental since Tuesday. The day winds on, and you find yourself once again staring at the cracks in the ceiling while your stomach makes quiet, passive-aggressive noises. The royal physician has long since swept away in his embroidered cloud, and the ward has returned to its usual mix of chanting, coughs, and the occasional bowl of boiled bark. That's when she arrives. Not in a procession, not in velvet, just quietly, with a basket on her hip and a firm nod to the nuns. A woman of maybe 45 or 60 or ageless, in the way that people become when they've seen too much and somehow come out wiser for it. She's here to treat a patient in the corner, not with relics, not with astrology, but with knowledge born from dirt, sweat, and generations of whispered cures. You're witnessing the delicate, precarious presence of a woman healer, one of the countless wise women, midwives, and herbalists who existed just slightly outside the approved hierarchy of medicine, revered by their neighbors, feared by authorities, and always at risk of becoming too good at what they did. She kneels beside a young woman with swollen joints and begins to examine her feet with skilled hands. No gloves, no scrolls, no Latin recitations, just a cloth bundle of ground comfrey root, a small flask of warmed wine, and a calm that instantly fills the space. You notice the other patients watching. Even the monk in charge pretends to be focused on his reading, but keeps one eye on the healer's gentle movements. These women were often the real doctors of their villages. They delivered babies, set bones, soothed fevers, and brewed potions with names like Blessed Thistle Wash and Sleepy Sage Syrup. Their knowledge wasn't written in books. It was passed hand to hand, voice to ear, sometimes guarded like treasure, sometimes shared freely by firelight, and therein lay the problem, because while they healed, they also threatened the carefully constructed authority of the church and the universities. A woman who healed too well might be called blessed one week, and witch the next, especially if her potions worked better than a prayer and a leech. Historians still argue how many of these women were persecuted specifically because of their healing practices. Some were accused of using sorcery, others of spreading disease just to offer a cure, and some were simply too popular for the local priest's comfort. You look back to the woman as she gently ties a cloth soaked in her comfrey mixture around the patient's knee. She murmurs something too soft to catch, but it sounds more like kindness than incantation. She then presses a dry sprig of lavender into the patient's palm. "Smell this," she says. "When you remember the pain, remind it who's in charge." She stands, dusts off her apron, and without a word, moves on. You glance down at the tiny vial she left on the table by your cot. It's filled with a dark syrup, almost black in the candlelight. A note tied with twine reads, simply, "For restless nights. A few drops will tell the dreams to hush. You don't ask what's in it. You don't need to." A nun collects the healer's things and places them back in her basket with a care you haven't seen before. Not reverent, but respectful. She knows this woman's remedies work, even if no priest has blessed them, maybe because no priest has blessed them. And yet, this healer, like so many others, must walk carefully. A woman who understands herbs is useful. A woman who understands too much is dangerous. The line between midwife and heretic is paper thin in these halls. You wonder how many of these women have disappeared over the years. How many names were lost because they were spoken in kitchens, not classrooms, but their fingerprints remain. On every dried plant, every recipe scribbled in the margin of a prayer book, every nun who hides a little extra honey in the fever tonic as the healer leaves. She glances your way, just for a moment. Her eyes say, "Drink the syrup, let the dreams hush," and you will, because not all magic wears robes. You lie back again, syrup vial tucked safely beneath your blanket like a secret. The room settles into its usual mix of sighs and mumbling. Somewhere behind a curtain, someone is humming what sounds like a love song. A nun passes with a tray of warm water and salted root slices, and you think just for a second you might make it through the week without bleeding from somewhere new. Then a boy runs in holding a scroll high over his head, eyes wide, cheeks flushed. He nearly slips on spilled broth, steadies himself, and blurts, "We found another one, a recipe for heart longing." He means a love potion. And yes, that's absolutely still considered medical treatment in this part of the world. He scurries over to the nearest monk, unrolls the scroll with trembling hands, and points excitedly at a passage written in elaborate Latin and extremely hopeful illustrations. You recognize the ingredients immediately: rose petals, honey, wine, pigeon blood, and about 3 kinds of dried flour you're fairly sure were also used in embalming. Crushed rose hips, the monk mutters, tracing the text. Boil thrice. Whisper the name of the beloved into the steam. Serve in a pewter cup on a waxing moon. You are very awake now. Love potions, it turns out, were a surprisingly common feature in medieval medicine. Afflictions of the heart, unrequited love, obsession, unexplained longing, or melancholy of the stomach caused by beauty were all considered valid medical conditions. The cure, something between alchemy and poetry. The logic was simple. The body and the soul were linked. If your soul was aching, your humors would rebel. Too much sighing could lead to fevers. Dreaming about someone too often, that might sour the blood. Crying into your porridge every morning, clearly. Your spleen was tangled with longing. So yes, love potions weren't indulgent nonsense. They were treatment. You watch as the monk and boy gather ingredients with great seriousness. Honey is mixed first, then wine, a pinch of powdered violet, a strand of someone's hair you don't ask. Into the fire it goes, bubbling slowly, the scent sweet and sharp, like hope and recklessness. The scroll insists that the potion must be sung to. The monk obliges, humming a soft tune while stirring counterclockwise. Always counter, he says. Clockwise invites memory. Counter invites desire. You're not sure if that's medical advice or a breakup lyric. Across the ward, another patient groans and mutters, "Try it on Agnes first." If it works, I'll order 2. A nun intervenes at this point, not to stop it, but to supervise. No more than 1 cup per week, she warns, and none for the plague patients. Last time someone tried to woo through fever. It got very confusing. You glance at your own table and wonder what your chart might say. Mild melancholia, faint spleen disturbance. Now maybe a dash of romantic confusion from watching the monk sing to boiling wine. You're told the potion should be taken while thinking deeply of the beloved. If no beloved is known, the drinker must gaze into a polished bowl of water and wait to see whose face appears. You ask what happens if it's your own. The monk pauses. Then, he says gravely, you are truly doomed. The love potion is eventually carried away, cradled like a newborn, to be administered in another chamber. You lie back again, heart unbothered but slightly curious. Somewhere, someone is treating loneliness with rosewater and ritual. Someone is whispering names into steam. Someone believes desire can be distilled. Historians still debate whether these potions were symbolic, placebo, or just emotional support disguised as medicine. Likely all 3, because in a world where most suffering is invisible, even a bitter sip of herbal wine feels like action. And sometimes, action is what people need. As the scent of rose and honey fades from the air, your eyes begin to close. A patient nearby sighs and rolls over, mumbling, "If she comes to visit tomorrow, I'll pretend the potion worked." You smile, because in this place of leeches, trepanning, and boiled turnips, a potion for love might just be the most human cure of all. You awaken in the middle of the night to the unmistakable sound of someone screaming through clenched teeth. It's not a soul in peril kind of scream. More like the kind of scream you make when a stranger is sawing into your leg with a knife that's been cleaned by being waved briefly through a candle flame. Ah, surgery. The monks are mid-procedure now. No hiding it behind a curtain. No polite explanations. Just one poor fellow on a sturdy wooden bench with 3 people holding him down, a bucket catching whatever needs catching, and a surgeon wearing a look of intense concentration that might also just be nausea. The man's leg is splintered, wrapped, and now being unwrapped. They're going in. You sit up slowly, peering over your scratchy blanket, trying not to breathe too loudly in case someone remembers your knee's been making odd noises lately. Surgery in the medieval world was not for the faint of heart or faint of anything. No anesthesia, no sterile tools, no gentle bedside manner, just a good grip, a sharp blade, and usually a mouthful of something alcoholic to dull the senses, not for the surgeon, for the patient. The room is tense. One monk murmurs prayers under his breath. A young assistant sweats visibly as he pours vinegar over the patient's exposed wound, and the surgeon leans in with a knife that once might have been a kitchen utensil. The leg is sawed. It is wrapped. It is blessed. You have no idea if it's healing or a polite form of panic, but the whole room exhales when it's over. Surgery in this era is usually reserved for desperation, battlefield wounds, infected limbs, things that are already on their way out. If your arm turns purple and smells like cheese, they might consider amputation. If your eye starts leaking pus, they'll probably try to lance it and hope for the best. And if your leg breaks, that's actually where things get kind of clever. Medieval bone setting wasn't always gruesome. In fact, some bone setters, especially those trained outside the university system, were known for real skill. They'd splint, bind, and brace using wooden rods, padded cloth, and sometimes boiled leather to create makeshift casts. No anesthesia, sure, but also no unnecessary drama. Just fast, firm, and frighteningly calm. You once overheard a patient being told to bite this stick and think of something you like. Apparently, he bit clean through the stick and shouted, "Butter." You lie back, grateful that all your limbs are currently attached and mostly unbloodied. Still, it's not all horror and hacksaws. There are efforts to ease the pain. Opium poppy extracts were used. Wine-soaked cloths helped. And if nothing else, a few sips of something strong might make you forget what's coming. Historians still argue whether medieval surgeons were barbaric but effective or just brave enough to try things others wouldn't. There are records of successful trepanning, tumor removals, and wound stitching using fine silk or horsehair. Some patients lived. Some lived long enough to complain about it. There's even a record of one surgeon who insisted on operating while humming. It steadies the hand. He claimed his patients reportedly found it less comforting. You watch as the surgical team quietly cleans up. The tools are rinsed in wine, wiped on linen, and laid out like instruments in a grim, wet symphony. The patient has passed out, or possibly ascended. It's hard to say. You're given a small flask of warmed ale, in case it's your turn tomorrow. The nun says cheerfully. You take a long sip and silently vow never to stub your toe again. Somewhere behind you, another patient mutters in his sleep. I'll take the singing leeches over this. A fair trade. You roll over and whisper a quiet thanks to whatever part of your skeleton is currently behaving. So far, your spleen hasn't burst, your jaw hasn't locked, and no one's reached for the bone saw on your behalf. Small miracles, one leg at a time. Morning returns to the ward with its usual routine of coughing, clinking, and someone accidentally spilling a bowl of fennel broth onto their own shoes. You stretch gently, thankful that all your limbs remain yours and unsawed, and glance toward the far end of the hall where a group of monks is huddled around a parchment pinned to a wooden board. There's an air of anticipation, muttered Latin, raised eyebrows, and a young apprentice whispering. They're actually doing it. They're finally handing them out. You're about to witness something rare, mildly controversial, and extremely overdue, the licensing of medical practitioners. Yes, after centuries of well-meaning barbers, beetle slingers, and aggressive herbalists, The church and the universities have begun issuing official medical licenses, mostly to prevent more people from accidentally dying of cabbage compresses and frog-based lung remedies. One monk stands tall and reads aloud a list of newly approved practitioners. The crowd listens with bated breath, or possibly indigestion. Each name is followed by the city of study and the area of permitted expertise: bones, bleeding, bile, or miscellaneous spleen arts. It's meant to bring order to chaos. But you can already hear the whispers from the back. He never studied in Bologna. I've seen her leech a goat backwards. They gave him a license, because for every honest healer, there are still 10 who learned medicine by accident, inheritance, or sheer confidence. And now, the church wants to regulate it, to put its stamp on the most chaotic profession in Europe. Historically, this shift was a huge deal. Before the 13th century, anyone could declare themselves a physician. All you needed was a sharp knife and a vague understanding of urine. But as universities grew and wealthy patients demanded safer, less fatal experiences, licensing became a necessity, sort of. The first medical licenses were issued in southern Europe: Spain, Italy, where city councils and bishops worked together to make sure doctors had some idea what they were doing. But the system wasn't perfect. There were bribes, forgeries, and plenty of licensed professionals who still thought hot tar cured fevers. Historians still debate whether this movement was driven by genuine concern for public health or by a desire to control competition. Either way, it changed the future of medicine. You watch as a young woman steps forward, hands trembling slightly, and receives a scroll tied with red string. Her name is inscribed with care. The crowd nods approvingly. She bows. Behind her, a man in dusty robes mutters, "Well, she does wash her hands, so there's that." The ward buzzes with quiet awe. Some grumble about tradition, others cheer for progress. One patient sighs and says, "I liked it better when they just used onion." You lie back, wondering what your own caregivers would score on this new medical rubric. The monk who sang to your leeches, a solid B for passion. The nun with the herbal syrups, A+. The royal physician with the powdered pearls, A? C- for reality, A+ for drama. The nun tending to you arrives with a warm compress and a smile. "Don't worry," she says. "I don't have a license, but I do have 6 stubborn brothers and a recipe for clove tea that could frighten off the plague." You smile and accept the compress, because honestly, a piece of parchment is nice, but knowing when to hum, when to touch a hand, and when to change the bandage without being asked, that's harder to teach. The monk returns to his reading. The apprentices lean closer. The list of names continues. Somewhere down the corridor, someone's practicing how to say liver in Latin without spitting. You close your eyes, warmed by the compress, lulled by the soft cadence of bureaucratic Latin, and comforted by the idea that maybe, just maybe, the future of medicine is starting to crawl out of the onion-scented darkness and into something a little more reliable. One license at a time. The candles burn low. The sky outside fades from dusty blue to the soft grey of approaching dusk. The ward has quieted. Even the man who usually mutters about frogs in his stomach has nodded off, drooling peacefully into a cabbage-stuffed pillow. You're warm, tired, and slightly crusted in whatever that last poultice contained. But tonight, the mood in the hall is different. Not panicked, not fevered, just final. A nun makes her rounds with a bowl of rose water and linen strips. She washes each patient's hands and feet, gently, like she's tucking in the idea of illness itself. She hums while she works something soft, old, and low enough to make the candle flames flicker. This is no longer about fever or spleens or singing leeches. This is about preparing the body for rest, not the kind you wake from, because here, in the medieval hospital, death is part of the medicine. There's no dramatic mourning, no loud wailing, just ritual. Calm, linen, prayer, a kind of hush that makes you breathe slower without meaning to. You glance toward the corner where an elderly patient has been lying for days. They're still now, wrapped in layers of soft cloth. A monk sits nearby, whispering psalms over their still body. No one rushes, no one weeps. This has been coming, and they've prepared. A small pot of balm is opened, rose oil, lavender, and marjoram. It's dabbed gently onto the forehead and over the heart. The scent fills the room, warm and floral. The nun holds the hands for a moment, closes the eyes with reverence, and whispers, "May your humors find peace." That's the goal, really. For all the guesswork, bloodletting, beetles, and backwards recited love charms, the point was always to bring the body back to balance, to coax the soul gently back into alignment with itself, or to ease it out. When alignment was no longer an option, historians still argue how well medieval medicine worked, but no one disputes the care, the layers of meaning, the belief that health wasn't just a matter of bones and bile, but of spirit, story, and connection. As the nuns finish tending to the deceased, the other patients turn slightly in their beds, not afraid, not disturbed, just acknowledging what passed through. A few murmur prayers, one man whispers, "Good journey." Then quiet returns. Your turn comes next. Not to die, don't worry, just to be wrapped, blessed, and calmed for the night. The nun kneels beside your bed, dips her fingers into the rose balm, and smooths a line across your temple. For sleep, she says. For rest, you nod, eyes heavy. The same cloth that touched the hands of the dying touches yours, not to frighten you, but to remind you that you are part of the same continuum, same ward, same breath. You close your eyes. Behind your eyelids, you see leeches humming, monks flipping through rhyming scrolls, barbers sharpening razors next to jars of crushed emerald, women with baskets of garlic and turnips muttering about liver heat, a toad in a footbath, a surgeon singing while sawing a tibia, and a cat definitely alive settled firmly on someone's belly, refusing to move. And through it all, you hear the echo of that first moment, stepping into the ward, the flicker of candles, the hiss of boiled herbs, the moment you thought, well, I probably won't survive this, but you did. And now, as the last candle gutters and a soft chant begins in the distance, you let the medieval world of healing wild, messy, sincere wrap around you like warm linen. You made it. The night has come in full now. Outside, the stars begin to blink softly into place, slow and watchful, as if even they are pausing to listen. The ward is silent. Even the embers in the hearth have stopped crackling, resting beneath a quiet veil of ash. You lie there, still and warm, the scent of rose oil lingering faintly at your temples, the weight of the day gently dissolving like sugar in water. Your breath settles into a slow, steady rhythm, matching the rustle of the linens and the soft hum of a chant that no longer needs words. You made it through singing leeches, rhyming remedies, planetary pea analysis, and a brush with trepanning you'd rather not repeat. You've been wrapped in goose fat, sprinkled with herbs, evaluated by monks and peasant grannies alike, and somehow it all led you here, to stillness, to rest, and maybe, just maybe, to the quiet understanding that care comes in many forms: messy, strange, sung, stirred, whispered through rosemary smoke, or tucked into a sachet under your pillow. It doesn't always need to be right, it just needs to try. The world you've journeyed through tonight may have been full of missteps and misdiagnoses, but it was also full of hands rough, soft, ink-stained, calloused, reaching out to help. So now, let your limbs go heavy, let your mind drift gently away, like a leech full of melancholy floating in a basin of peace. You're safe, you're wrapped, you're done. Sleep well.